So in this I'm going to focus on the ones that symbolize imbalance. I'm not really going to focus too much on things that are about balance, and that'll be a different video. I will have totems that symbolize balance in a different video, but these are the ones that if you see these a lot, if they're constantly around you, at one or two things, there may be an imbalance in your chakras or your life or lifestyle, or it may go way beyond you, and there may be an imbalance in nature itself, in that specific place, maybe where Mother Nature is weak and there's an imbalance. So just because these totems are seen kind of sometimes in a bad light, doesn't mean that they're meaningless. It doesn't mean that they're purposeless. And it doesn't mean that they're, you know, flat out evil, okay? However, I will say that a lot of spirits that end up being born into these totems, meaning, you know, a lot of individual spirits, if you're born as a cardinal, if you're born as a grizzly bear, if you're born as a raccoon, okay, if you're born as something like that, the odds, because of the totemic meaning, and I'll get into the totemic meanings in a minute, the odds of that spirit being born as that and being a selfless, loving, balanced spirit can happen, yes, with an individual, but normally it doesn't. Because these totems are known for imbalance, usually the spirits that end up being born as these totems, these individual animals that are born, typically their individual personalities are not very kind. They're very selfish creatures usually. Like I said, it depends on the individual. It totally depends on the individual. But typically, they're very selfish creatures, they're very arrogant creatures, very sometimes even aggressive creatures. But, you know, when your whole life's purpose is to be a symbol of imbalance, you know, then you're kind of living up to your purpose anyway. And you think about squirrels, for example. They're a huge symbol of, they're actually the biggest irony ever, because they are themselves a creature of imbalance, but by accident they are so greedy and so arrogant and so selfish that by accident they actually end up creating balance. A squirrel will hog all the food and bury it and not even eat half of it and bury it for winter. Out of what they bury, they're lucky to find 1/3 of the things that they bury, because they bury so much that they forget where they buried them. The other 2/3, which is more than half, way more than half, they can never find. They can't ever eat it, they never find it, and it turns into forests because they plant tree seeds. The tree seeds, they don't remember where they planted them. They can't dig them up because they can't remember where they planted them. And those seeds sprout into trees and grow new forests. So ironically, the squirrel actually mends and heals, as odd as it sounds, this is bizarre, but as odd as it sounds, the squirrel actually heals the land through his greed. I have to admire actually that totem. I do. I have to admire that totem, because that is such an irony that you can't help but admire it. But you know, other things not so much. Other things really don't have that unique symbiotic irony to them. Raccoons are a really good example. And this is actually something that most people don't know much about raccoon totem. They say they do, but really when you start asking people, they'll say, well, raccoon wears a mask, raccoon is a deceiver, and the only people who can see raccoon for who he really is are people who have been able to see past his mask. So basically, they're people usually with owl totems, or maybe wolf totems, or both, or some other totem that allows them to see truth, hidden truth. Especially owl totem is really the best at seeing hidden truth, I'd say. And because I have that as one of my main totems, maybe it's just pretty obvious for me, but most people will leave it at that. Most people will leave it at, you know, the deception, the mask, and that no one really knows who he is or what he stands for. Well, I'm here to tell you right now that deception is for to try and create a false persona, to try and create that this is okay, look at me, look how harmless I am. If you look at raccoons' teeth and raccoons' claws, it's much like humans. Raccoon has gotten slower over evolution. He's gotten slower, his claws has gotten smaller, his teeth has gotten smaller, his muzzle's gotten shorter, his ears has gotten smaller. And if you look at humans, and even primates, most primates really, if you look at humans, which I'll get into primates in a minute, but humans have lost all their fangs, all their claws. They're slow, very slow. And maybe a raccoon to you is fast, but to a fox it's very slow. So there's an old pagan saying that the more wrong you do, the more that is taken away from you, the more strength that is taken away from you. Raccoon is a very aggressive, arrogant and selfish totem. Not all raccoons are like that, but in general that is kind of what the totem stands for. The totem will, basically raccoons will kill off any and everything around them. They will, if not kill off, they will chase it away. They create immense imbalances. They eat the babies of predatory birds like owls. Try as they might, even very large owls are too small to pry off that really heavy raccoon. And so, you know, that most times the raccoon kills the babies before they can pry the raccoon off, because it's got opposable thumbs, it can latch onto stuff, and it's too heavy. They can carry off a lot of things, but it's really difficult to pry something like that off. And so you get a lot of endangered species dying because of raccoons, especially predatory birds, raptors. And that's just one thing. I could go on and on and on, but raccoon basically is a symbol of, you know, that what you hold dear to you is in jeopardy. If you see that everywhere, and there's no rhyme or reason to it, it may just be the land itself. Like I said, it may not be specific to you, it may just be the land itself that is in peril. You really just have to kind of think, okay, what's going on in my life right now, to figure out what or why that totem might be constantly, you know, revealing itself to you. Nowadays raccoons are so overpopulated that most of the time, you know, 6 one, half a dozen or the other, because they're everywhere anyway. Go down to primates just for a moment. I want to compare these two primates because one is a symbol of immense destruction, and the other is a symbol of immense healing and protection. Okay, so we've got a gorilla that is the protector, the healer, the mender. It's a symbol of balance. And we've got the chimpanzee, which is the exact opposite. Destruction, you know, killer of anything good, anything, you know, it's destruction of the land, the nature, everything itself. In fact, most chimpanzees don't even, they're kind of like people. They don't even have the voices of nature in them, meaning they're not connected to nature anymore. They don't have that connection. They don't have the ability to connect with nature. And that is how bad chimpanzees are, almost as bad off as humans. And you know, you look at the heredity and the genetics, and it's no surprise that they are our closest relatives. But you look at a gorilla, and you know they're a primate too. They're both primates. They look similar at first glance. You understand how massive and strong the gorilla is, and how puny the chimpanzee is. And that's again the old pagan saying about the longer you do wrong, the weaker and smaller you get, the more that's taken away from you. That's just another example. Songbirds, titmice, I don't know exactly how to say that, cardinal, warblers, things like that. Some finches, like a golden finch, but you know, there's many finches that are not that way. But you'll find many songbirds have that same very arrogant, selfish vibe to them. That is their energy. And if a specific species, you know, has that energy for long enough, these songbirds, they have their way of basically stealing all the food from all the other birds and creating overpopulation of their own species, so that no other species can exist while they're there, you know. But other songbirds are totally the exact opposite, like we were talking about with the gorilla and the chimpanzee. It just depends. Another example of polar opposites, no pun intended, is grizzly bear versus a black bear or a polar bear. The black bear and the polar bear are a symbol of balance and healing. The grizzly bear is a symbol of destruction and imbalance. And it's all because of the totemic meaning. Most grizzly bears are arrogant, selfish, again, that same kind of, it's got that same kind of energy. But most black bears and polar bears are not that way at all. If you find an aggressive black bear or polar bear, it's aggressive because it's either starving or it feels threatened. But grizzly bears are aggressive just because they feel like they want to, just because they can. You know, so all of these things end up being, you can find a pattern. You can find a pattern in it. And again, I will say grizzly bear is one of those things that you could probably find. It's one of those species that you could probably find several individuals within a group that are not arrogant or selfish at all. So that's actually, I'd say about 70–75% go towards the totemic meaning, and the rest don't. So they're all bears, you know, and you would think that it would all have the same totemic meaning. And it gets even more complex and complicated, because if you were greeted by a grizzly bear, if it showed itself to you, for example, but that individual bear had no greed, no malice, no arrogance, then the totemic meaning of that individual bear would be more like the totemic meaning of a black bear or a polar bear. So that's where it really gets complicated, because maybe the totem as a whole is known for destruction and imbalance, but you could run across an individual bear that is that same totem, still a grizzly bear, but is actually creating balance instead. So that's where it gets really complicated. So I'm just trying to point out species that tend to have they tend to have something that, you know, you can see a pattern with. But just because you can see a pattern doesn't mean that they're always going to bring in balance. Bats is another one. Small migratory bats tend to bring, not all of them, but many of those species tend to bring, and even some small species that are not migratory, tend to bring imbalance. But flying foxes, for example, are the exact opposite. They're the exact opposite of imbalance. They actually create balance. So there's just on and on and on about every, I mean, I couldn't even fit them in here, but those are, I say, my top examples of what to look for in totems that create imbalance.